you've gone through something difficult, this is kind of the framework for how grief goes. At first it's shock, and then you're gonna feel the darkest you've ever felt in your life as the reality of things begin to set in. And that's where I found myself about 3 weeks to a month after everything happened and people started going on with their lives and back to their homes and back,
Mhm.
now here I was by myself with Weston going, I don't want to live anymore.
Welcome back to Divine Revelations Unleashed. And on today's episode, we're going to be talking to Davey Blackburn. And Davey Blackburn recently came out with a book called Nothing is Wasted, a true story of hope, forgiveness, and finding purpose in pain. And he talks about a widely covered story in the media is where his wife and unborn daughter were murdered. And so he talks about going through that, the grief and all the challenges, but also how he found purpose in pain. And so we're going to be hearing more from Davey about his story and his journey. Again, his book is called Nothing is Wasted. So I really hope that you enjoy this podcast interview with Davey Blackburn. Well, Davey, welcome to the podcast. Happy to have you on.
Yeah, thanks, Cameron. It's an honor to be here with you.
Yeah, and congratulations on your new book, Nothing is Wasted, a true story of hope, forgiveness, and finding purpose in pain.
Yeah, thank you, man. This is it really is a delight to be able to get this story and this message out into the world. And so I appreciate you being willing to have a conversation with me about it.
Yeah, it's been great learning about your story and actually wanted to learn more about it. I think one of the pastors I follow shared that your book is coming up soon and pre-order it. That's how I came across you. And it's been amazing following your ministry as well. That you have Nothing and Wasted Ministries, which we'll talk about later on, because you offer so much within that ministry, and now with this book coming out to share your story, that has really grabbed, I think, the nation when that happened. It really grabbed that. Uh, so much attention. But where I really wanted to start with unpacking your story a little bit is tell us a little bit about how life was and your journey, because you were in ministry and you are still in ministry. And before this tragedy hit that you write about in the book, tell us a little bit about your journey before and how did your journey in ministry start? Let's start there.
Yeah. Well, before my life was turned upside down in 2015, I was a pastor, a church planter. I was married to this wonderful woman, Amanda, and we, at the time of 2015, we had a 15-month-old named Weston, and we were pregnant with our second. But leading up to that, she and I got married in 2008. We actually had a double wedding with her sister and my brother-in-law now, who was my best friend, who introduced Amanda to me. So it was a really sweet, sweet, full circle kind of thing where we all shared that wedding day together, and it was just a beautiful way to start life out together. We ended up going and working at our what we would consider our dream job as a youth pastors at a really large, fast-growing church in South Carolina, and thought we would be there for the rest of our lives. But about 3.5 years into that, God just really began to stir on our hearts to move to plant a church, and we prayed against it for about 8 months. Because it just seems so daunting and intimidating. We're like, no, we're good with how comfortable and convenient life is right now. And but man, we just couldn't escape it. And we just knew that God was calling us to do that. When we finally opened our hands up to that, we felt just this clarity that He was calling us to move to Indianapolis to plant a church. And I joke about this a lot, that when God calls you to plant a church, it feels like He calls you to plant a forest, but drops you in the middle of a parking lot,
Yeah.
because it's just hard work. It's not for the faint of heart. And some people who come to me and go, "Hey, I want to plant a church," I'm like, I try to convince them not to, because if I can convince them not to, they probably weren't called to, because it takes a certain level of resilience and it's just a daunting task. But I remember the momentum really picking up on in our church after a few years, about 3 years of us being there and building kind of a core team. And going into the fall of 2015, we were seeing, man, this thing is actually taking. And there's some, this is, you kind of get to this place as a church planter where you go, okay, we've hit critical mass. Like, this is actually going to begin to snowball in a good direction. And I remember Amanda looking at me and going, "Man, Davey, our dreams are coming true, and God is working in such profound ways in the people that we're ministering to." And that was the weekend before she was killed,
Mm.
November 10th, 2015. It was a normal Tuesday morning. I left to go to the gym, and three men who were on a crime spree, random crime spree in our city, they broke into the home three doors down from me and saw me leave for the gym that morning and decided to break into our home. And Amanda was caught up in that home invasion and no doubt trying to protect Weston. Um, all the details are a little bit fuzzy because it's only based on the testimonies of the guys who were a part of it, but she was shot three times. I came home from the gym and found her. When I found her, she was on our living room floor, lying face down, surrounded by blood. And um, she was still breathing, but it was very laborious. And I called the paramedics, and they felt like, in a moment like that, it's that traumatic. It just feels like everything goes fast motion and slow motion at the same time. So it felt like it took 3 hours for the paramedics to get there. It only took 3 minutes. But when they attended to her, they got her into the ambulance and started to head to the hospital, told me to get Weston and to follow them. And I just fully expected that we'd get to the hospital, everything would be fine. You just have an expectation of how life's going to go, of how, your dreams are going to go, your marriage is going to go. And this was beyond anything that I had expected. And so I just knew and was convinced that she was going to be fine, that maybe at the worst that we lost the baby. When the doctors and investigators informed me that she had three bullet wounds, the prognosis was not very good. And 24 hours later, she was pronounced officially deceased. And that was November 11th, 2015.
Mm.
And it happened to be 4 years to the day that we packed a moving van up from South Carolina to move to Indianapolis to plant the church. That took place in November 11th, 2011.
Mhm.
So just this this thing where we were grabbing life by the horns, and we were making our dreams happen, and then all of a sudden everything's turned upside down in one moment.
Mm. What was in those initial moments? What was really going through your mind and heart at that time?
Well, mostly shock. I couldn't believe that it happened. I was a pastor at the time, so I had a lot of theological training. I had a really what I would consider to be a strong faith. My family has a rich heritage of faith. My dad's a pastor. I joke around a lot that I had a drug problem growing up, that I was drugged to church every time the doors were open. I was just immersed in that. And so I had this belief, I guess, this expectation of God that as long as I follow after God, everything's going to be good in my life. Everything's going to be up and to the right. Almost like, I'll be healthy, wealthy, and wise, right? And it was just
Yeah.
these things that scripture never says that, right? That was Benjamin Franklin talking about going to bed early and waking up early. It's like, but we have these constructs or ideas of how we think that God is supposed to interact and intervene in our lives. And we usually put that on a merit basis. And for me, that was the case. I'm like, well, God, we're following after you. We're in the middle of your calling. And so there's going to be, I'm sure you're going to protect our family. We might go through hard, but we're always going to be together. And so this completely disoriented my view of God, my view of myself, my view of this world. And immediately that played out in just shock. I could not believe that anything like this would have happened. And I'm sure anybody in any kind of tragedy, any kind of trauma, that's the first stage. So they're just like, I can't believe this is my life.
Mm.
And this is what I'm waking up to every day. And for the first couple of days and weeks, that's what I felt. On top of that, there was complexity with the fact that this became this like national news story.
Yeah.
And for 2 weeks, these men were still at large. Finally arrests were made after 2 weeks. But, that adds a layer of complexity of trying to sort through grief, shock, denial, anger. On some, on one level, you can sort through that stuff as you can do it privately, right? But now we're having to do this in front of the whole world. And it felt like everybody was looking in. Most people were just very encouraging and lifting us up in prayer. But then, there was your few voices that were really scrutinizing, and that felt like salt in the wound. And so there's layers and layers and layers of complications of feelings and emotions there. But I'll never forget, a couple weeks after, as everything begins to subside, I started just slipping into a really deep, dark depression and sadness and despair.
Mm.
And I do think now, retroactively looking back on it, that's what I usually tell people to prepare for. If they've gone through something difficult, this is kind of the framework for how grief goes. At first, it's shock, and then you're gonna feel the darkest you've ever felt in your life as the reality of things begin to set in. And that's where I found myself about 3 weeks to a month after everything happened, and people started going on with their lives and back to their homes and back.
Mhm.
Now here I was by myself with Weston, going, I don't want to live anymore. I
Yeah.
can't imagine having to face every single day without her.
Mm. How old was Weston at that time?
Weston was 15 months old.
Oh wow. So
Yeah.
how did, because you weren't only grieving on your own and trying to find healing, you were also helping uh be a father to
Yeah.
your son at the same time. So how was that in terms of, you talked a little bit about um your grief in the months after that, but how did you really start that, I guess maybe that healing journey in terms of um grieving and now moving towards healing?
Yeah. Well, yeah, you said it right. There was this additional complication of trying to be a single dad and trying to play, or at least what I thought I was supposed to play dad role and mom role at the same time. Right. I
Yeah.
realized now as I move through it that I'm insufficient to do that. I'm insufficient to even be a great dad to Weston. I can do my very best, but at the end of the day, I need him to rely on the Lord for all of his source. And my job is just to point him to that. And so God can be for us what we really need in those moments. He's the great I am, right? Which means he is what we need him to be. He's the provider, he's the comforter, he's the healer, he's the sustainer. And so, but I didn't really truly know that at the time. We don't really know that till we need it. And so I'm trying to figure out how to be a single dad to him. I'm also trying to help my congregation, who
Hmm.
most of them really had come to the church and gotten to know Amanda so closely. They're grieving as well. They're trying to hold me up, but I'm the pastor and shepherd. So normally
Yeah.
in a situation, you would be the one helping them grieve. And yet, so it was just this layers and layers of complication. But I would say at first, I thought that I had to be strong for everybody. And I thought that I guess my pastoral training didn't really serve me very well in this. I thought, you know what, I've got to put the S on my chest and the cape and be like, okay, we're gonna trust God in this. And I knew that to be true here. I just didn't feel it here.
Mm.
And I didn't have any place to put my grief. So I started getting physically sick because I was holding all of it in and I didn't know how to really process my grief really well. In fact, the first counselor that I went and saw was like 2 weeks after it happened. He looked at me and goes, I don't know how to help you. And that's a pretty unnerving thing to have a counselor, someone who's trained and expert at this, go, yeah, I'm sorry, I don't know how to help you.
Wow.
I'm like, is it that bad? Like, how am I supposed to sort through this and get through this? But there were a couple of things that really kept me, excuse me, kept me really tethered through the whole thing. God showed up in really tremendous ways early on. The first in the hospital while we were waiting on test results to come back, I knew that if Amanda could hear anything, she would want to listen to elevation worship. And so I put at the foot of her bed Pandora radio station elevation worship. Well, Pandora is randomized. You don't get to choose what comes up the song. And the first song that came up was the song Nothing is Wasted by Elevation Worship. And I was familiar with that song. It had been a song that had really carried us through the church planting process. I loved it. I grabbed hold of its truths, but I was grabbing hold of it even more so profoundly in that moment. And I looked at her sister who was on the other side of her hospital bed, and we didn't even have to, I mean, just tears came to our eyes. We knew that God was essentially reaching into that moment and telling us, hey, this is not going to turn out the way you want it to, but I'm not going to waste this.
Mm.
And it was so profound and so personal because of what Amanda was doing at the time before she was killed. She had started a business called the Weathered Willow, where she was refinishing furniture and restoring them to bring value back and then selling them at antique shows. And she truly believed that nothing was wasted. I'd come home from work and she'd ask me to go pick up a dresser off the side of the road. And I'm like feeling like American pickers, like going and picking all this stuff up. And I remember looking at her one time and going, "This is garbage. What are you going to do with this?" And she said, "Davey, trust me, give me a little time, and I'm going to turn this into something beautiful." And every time she would, and she would add value to this and she would restore it. And that was really her heart. That's what she believed, that not just every piece of furniture, there was nothing wasted, but people's lives, there was nothing wasted, that God was a God of restoration and he could take any situation, any tragedy, any person's mistakes or their plight in life and he could restore it. And so that message of nothing is wasted really kept our family tethered. It
Mm.
became a mantra for us. And we held on to it. We held on to Romans 8:28, that God was working all things together for the good of those who love him, who've been called according to his purposes. And so that while that was a truth in my head, it wasn't something I was feeling. And so 3 weeks later, I'm physically sick. I'm on a couch and I get a text message from a pastor, and he started walking me through, as a big brother he had lost one of his a child of his. He started walking me through this idea of running toward the roar, of taking the triggers that I was experiencing in grief, and instead of running away from them or trying to suppress them or numb from them or try to be strong and push through them, actually lean into them, face them head on, and let God do a healing work in that. And that was a pivotal change for me, because the first trigger that I was experiencing was a song that would default to my Bluetooth in my car. I'd get in the car every time I'd take Weston somewhere. I'd get in my car, it would pop up, and it was a song that was played at Amanda and I's wedding. And I would be so angry, and it would just trigger me like crazy. And I would turn it off and I wouldn't want to listen to it. So I was just stuffing it and pushing it aside. So I decided, after talking with this pastor, to just run toward the roar and go and listen to it on purpose, intentionally. And I got in the car and I just started, listening to it on repeat, ugly cry for like 45 minutes. But eventually what happened is, I just call it waves of grief and then waves of grace following. God really met me in that moment. And all of that physical sickness that I was experiencing, it began to get untangled and it began to resolve. And what that did is it gave me a new tool. It gave me a sense of agency again, that I didn't have to just like take blow after blow after blow of grief on my heels. I could now partner with God in some of these invitations and not see triggers as villains in my story, but to see them as actual invitations from God to lean into the journey that he had for me of healing. My counselor, eventually I did see a counselor, and he was wonderful. He could help me. He says, God, we want God to heal in poof. And sometimes he does some really miraculous things to deliver us, but most of the time he heals in process. And so the next several months and years were a process of God restoring me and my putting my life, my heart, my soul back together. But it all came on the coattails of the next running toward the roar, of the next facing and confronting those triggers. And that's really what the book Nothing is Wasted really chronicles. It shows you each moment that God led me on this journey, and the reader gets into my head as I'm telling it in real time. And my hope is that the reader, they begin to see their own story in it. They begin to see their own places where they're running away from the things that are triggering them, that could really lead to their healing. Where they're um, found themselves in places of despair and grief. And I want them to read it and go, not, I don't want them to say, wow, Davey's an awesome guy. I want them to go, man, God is an awesome God, that he can bring Davey through this. And if he can bring Davey through this, he can bring me through whatever I'm going through too.
Mm. Yeah. You touched on something earlier about, you were leading a church at the time, you were a pastor, and tragedy hit your life. And, as a pastor, you're there shepherding and caring for your church, and you're pouring into your congregation. And how was that when this happened to you? Y- you had to receive that care yourself.
Yeah.
How was that for you as a pastor, and balancing that to being open and receptive to that care, but also balancing, I still have a church and congregation to lead and to
Yeah.
help them really understand what you're going through, because that's a real challenge. I'm sure it was.
Absolutely. Yeah. And you hit the nail on the head. It was very, very difficult. I mean, at first it was like there's a resistance there to receiving that kind of care.
Yeah.
But on some level, this was such an upending tragedy. I mean, like a limb from on my body had just gotten severed.
Hmm.
That it was one of those things I just realized, okay, if there's any time in life that I need to be open to receive, it's this time. And I'm grateful for that because I'm grateful for the people who rallied around me, not just the people in my immediate community, but all over the world who prayed for us. I believe more in the power of prayer than I've ever believed in my entire life because of the undergirding, the hammock of grace that carried us through that season. I attribute it to the power of prayer, of people, saints all over the world. And so on some level, it was like, yeah, it's really difficult. And there was a natural resistance because I'm used to shepherding and caring with other people. But on some level, it was like, this is so upending. This is
Yeah.
so unimaginable that I don't know what else to do. I honestly felt like I was the disciples in John chapter 6 when Jesus is laying out some hard teaching and people walk away from his
Hmm.
teaching. And he looks at the disciples and goes, are you not going to walk away too? And they're like, where are we going to go? You have the words of life.
Mm.
So I told God, I said, God, I don't know. There's no manual for this. I don't know. I can see if I don't let you guide me in this valley, I'm going to turn in to a very destructive person, both for me and toward other people. And so I just said, yes, God, whatever you are leading me to. And that was really huge because God and his providence and his grace began to lead me into some relationships that I needed to be led into, out of relationships I needed to be out of, so that I could be cared for. And then as I began to heal, and it wasn't, some people have the misnomer that like you've got to be healed before you can help other people. Actually, I believe quite the opposite because of my experience, but also because I mean, look at scripture. Jesus performed one of the greatest miracles, at least by volume, that we have record of, where he feeds the 5,000. What was happening right before that? Well, he had just gotten word that his cousin, John the Baptist, was beheaded. He was going away to try to grieve. And he probably felt in some of the weakest that he had ever felt in his life, probably also knowing that he was going to go to the cross, being triggered, going, it's not too long before this is going to happen to me too.
Hmm.
So imagine how distraught and weak he felt. And it says the crowd clamored to come around him. And in his brokenness, he becomes a blessing to other people. Out of his misery, he performs ministry. So I think that in the middle of while we're broken, while we're hurting, we can still help other people. In fact, we have a tenderness toward other people. We have an empathy toward other people that we've never had before. So I found that if I just started like sharing what God was doing in my life vulnerably, that it was helping me heal
Hmm.
and it was helping other people heal. And so that became on some level a new layer of leadership that I had thought before that, man, I've got to be strong as a leader. I got to kind of hide the way I'm actually feeling. But as I began to be more vulnerable about it, I started, it, it, it people started relating to it and they're going, yeah, me too. And I'm feeling that too. And then we were able to walk together. And so it was really just a beautiful thing across the board to see the kind of healing that was coming out of all of this as I was healing as well. And it gave me a massive sense of purpose. Like every time I would see life change happen, or as we finally started the podcast in 2017 and interviewed people who'd gone through difficult things, and we were hearing from all over the world, people were like, man, this is so helpful, these raw, honest conversations. It was like, wow, it was filling my heart with so much joy that was becoming a salve to my soul and bringing purpose and meaning to something that was senseless.
Hmm. Yeah, I think this would be a great opportunity to kind of unpack how Nothing is Wasted Ministries was birthed and the purpose behind that, because that's really where you found purpose from going through this. So during that time is that you found a platform to help others and also help others share their stories and bring other issues to light. So talk a little bit about how this ministry was birthed.
Yeah, it's interesting. You said you found a platform. Well, because our story was a national media story, it was like thrust on me. It wasn't like I was seeking it. Um, there were some very major disadvantages to grieving in the public eye. and under the
Yeah.
scrutiny of people. The one advantage of it though is that as I began to work with other people and help other people, I began to see, man, the stuff that you've led me through, God, it doesn't seem like a lot of people have the availability to them. They have the access to these kinds of resources. I'd go travel and speak at a church and share my story. And there'd be this long receiving line that would come up. And at first I'm thinking, oh, they're here to offer condolences to me. But I would find one after the other, they would share their story of pain with me, almost as if it was the first time they'd ever shared that at a church or been given permission to share it. And I started seeing like, man, like where you really, you really led me through a major valley, God. Why are you not doing it for others? And he goes, I am doing it for others. Some of them are not attuned to it. They're not aware of it. But also, Davey, and he like spoke words really into my soul that my mom had spoken to me all growing up. To whom much is given, much is required. And so I felt this sense of responsibility and stewardship that God had put me in this place to, and I'm not the only one. I by no means think that I'm the only one doing this. There's so many great people who are doing it, but I felt a personal sense of responsibility to say, okay, I've got to be one that can help other people through this. If God's done a work in me, he also wants to do a work through me. So it started very small. As I was pastoring the church, we started a podcast. I was writing a blog at the time, and there were tens of thousands of people that were reading the blog. And I don't say that to boast. I say that just to bring awareness to the fact that there are a lot of people who are hurting. You're listening to this right now. You're watching this right now. I don't have to tell you this, that pain is the common denominator of life. It visits all of us. It levels the playing field for all of us. But we don't often find places or platforms or spaces to be able to be honest about that pain and to really find true healing that we can work through it. And so as I was blogging, I found there were a lot of people who were going, oh man. And they had a lot of questions that they're like, can you help me as you've navigated yours? And I'm like, I can't keep writing fast enough. I was like, well, here, meet all these people that I've met along the journey, and we'll just put microphones in front of them and we'll let them share their story. Like it was on
Yeah.
some level a cop out, right? I'm like, I can't keep doing this. So let's just talk about this together. And it just began to take off. And after a couple of years of doing it, I felt this real strain. There was this tension. And what I look back on it now, I see it was a way that God was calling me out of pastoring the church. I had gotten remarried, which we can talk about in a second. It's beautiful, redemptive, and you can read about it in the book. Just amazing thing that God was doing as he was bringing Christy and I together. But we got remarried. We were pastoring the church together, and we just felt this sense that God was saying, you need to step out and do this thing full time. Nothing is wasted. And we wrestled with that for a while. And finally, we're like, okay, Lord, we'll do it. But it was a huge faith step because all I had was a podcast. I'm like, I don't know what in the world, how do you support a family through a podcast? But I knew I could travel and speak and share my story, and I could coach people one on one. So I began doing those things, and and over, the same thing would happen. Long receiving line, coaching people. It didn't matter their story. They all seemed like they were walking through the same kind of mile markers, right? Everybody was having to deal with all these like common denominators rose to the surface. And so as a coach, I was having to build a framework for people to go, here's how you should navigate this. Well, then we had a pastor who said, man, you should create like a curriculum or a framework that could help us as we're helping people. Clearly, there's a huge need here. So in 2019 and 2020, what emerged from that was this course called Pain to Purpose. Mm-hmm. And it's a framework. It's 11 videos, 10 waypoints of what we found everybody who's going to go from a story of pain into purpose. This is what they're going to have to deal with. They're going to have to confront these things. And they're going to have to begin to adopt some of these mindsets, right? So like waypoint 1, befriend your emotions, right? Waypoint 2, reframe your perspective. Waypoint 3, unclog your bitterness. Some of those things where it's like everyone, no matter what their story is. So then churches began asking for it that, hey, can we run this in small groups or a discipleship curriculum? So over the course of the last 4 years, really what we have kind of stumbled upon or what this evolved into is we're an ecosystem of content, community, and coaching. We have over 36 coaches now that coach people one-on-one. They're trauma informed. Many of them are trauma certified, and they've been certified through our Pain to Purpose framework or curriculum. And so if someone comes to our ministry and they go, hey, I've just lost a child, can you help me? I need some one-on-one help. We've got a coach who that's their story. They lost a child. They're just a little bit further ahead of them on the journey, and they've been trained and certified to walk them through pain to purpose, but also coach them. They're a certified coach to do that. So we've got everywhere from that level of investment with people all the way to doing pain to purpose at local churches or college campuses or correctional facilities in support group style, kind of like the Financial Peace University of Pain and Trauma is what we like to think of it as. And it's just been an amazing thing to see the content that we're creating, how it's encouraging people, the community that we're creating, how it's really stirring people up and spurring people on. The coaching is really just moving the needle in people's life when it comes to helping them heal from pain. So now we just walk beside local churches, college campuses, other organizations as they're creating spaces for people to heal.
That's awesome. And for those that want to find out more and connect with Nothing is Wasted Ministries, all the links are in the description on wherever you're watching or listening. So be able to connect with that. But Davey, before we wrap up, I wanted to talk about two more
Yeah.
topics, dealing with unanswered questions and then your
Mm.
life now and how it is today. How did you deal with, because you're a pastor at the time and you're still in ministry today, just in a different capacity. How did you deal with, I'm doing the works of the Lord, and why does this tragedy happen to me?
Mm.
Me, a pastor. Like, how did you deal with that, and how was that journey in, like, why does this happen to me? I planted a church and done all
Yeah.
this good work for you. Like, how did you deal? Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, that was a really big wrestling because again, like I said, I had, as I think a lot of people do, I had on some level constructed God in my image. So the God that I was believing in or serving, I had some misconceptions about him, even though I didn't think so. I thought I was pretty theologically sound, but my heart of hearts was saying, "Oh God, you're a vending machine, God. I approach you when I need something, want something, right?" And when all of a sudden now, if God's supposed to serve me the way that I thought he was supposed to serve me, and that doesn't happen, it totally disoriented my view of who
Mm,
God was. And I think God allows these kinds of seasons for that disorientation or deconstruction, if you will, to happen in our lives so that we can really see him for who he really is. Now, where deconstruction gets dangerous or where trauma can be very destructive in people's lives, what the enemy wants to get them to do is the enemy wants them to be stalled out, paralyzed, to get stuck, or to walk away from God, to blame God for their pain. Well, God's not to blame for our pain. There are perpetrators of pain. We talk about it in Pain to Purpose. Our own sinful choices is a perpetrator of pain, other people's sinful choices, that we live in a fallen and broken world, and their spiritual attack. We have a very real enemy that's trying to stall us out to thwart the plan that God has for our lives. None of those God can be blamed for. Now, God allows it. And on this side of eternity, we don't know why, but he is a great judo artist that will take what the enemy means for evil in our lives, turns it around against the enemy. As Timothy Keller says, he gives evil enough space in our lives that it terminates itself. So God has a plan in the midst of our pain. He's not a perpetrator of our pain. He has a plan to turn our pain around. And so as I began wrestling with God and taking those difficult questions, not just deconstructing and walking away from God, but going, okay, God, you are not what I thought or who I thought you were.
mhm.
I'm not who I thought I was. This world's not what I thought it was. Now show me who you really are. And he began to reveal through his word, through the Holy Spirit, through other people, these beautiful mysteries of who he is. And it's actually a richer, fuller version than the version that I had constructed God to be. And as I saw him for who he really is, I saw myself for who I really am. Right? I'm sinful. Just like you, when Job wrestles with God, he's like reminds him, like, "Hey, remember where were you when I hung the stars?" You kind of remember your place. Like, I'm not the point of this story, and it
Yeah.
really humbles you. And then you also get so overjoyed by the grace and mercy that God has given you and granted you and the healing that he's putting inside of you that you're like, well, while I'm not the point, God's asked me to play a part. This is a beautiful thing, right? So it begins to restore your soul and give you some purpose. And that's what happened to me. And then throughout the journey, there were some very pivotal things that God reminded me. He said, Davey, the disciples, the people who were closest to Jesus, all of their lives ended tragically.
True.
And it was like, wait, what? Yeah. And then I
Yeah.
remember reading a John Piper book called Filling Up the Afflictions of Christ. And he just chronicles a whole bunch of missionaries who are on the front lines of ministry who experienced tragedy. And it was like, oh, so these things aren't mutually exclusive, right? Like I can be in the middle of God's will and also experience tragedy. That sometimes it's not necessarily the safest place to be in the middle of God's will. You might be in the middle of a storm. You remember the disciples in Mark 4 who were going across, right, to go and minister to the demoniac, and they get caught in a storm, and Jesus is asleep in the stern of the boat. Like, come on, what? Jesus is the one that told them to go across, and they're in
Mm.
the middle of the storm. So just because you're following after Jesus doesn't mean you're gonna be impervious to hardship. No, Jesus said, "In this world you'll have trouble, but take heart. I've overcome the world." And there's something so much deeper, richer, more profound to have a calm in your spirit, that the storm in your heart is calm no matter what's going on around you. And that is really what's pervasive. That's the kind of blessing that lasts in our life.
Mm.
So that's really what I had to orient. My perspective became more heavenly. I'm not tied and tethered to the trappings of this world like I used to be. Now I have a gravitational pull back to that because I'm human, right? So I'm prone to wander, as the old hymn says. But man, the more that I experience, honestly, it's suffering that propels us back into this perspective that says, all right, here's what really matters in this life.
Mm. I love your perspectives on that because I know everyone listening or watching has those questions, those unanswered questions that are so hard to answer. So you really unpack that well. And Davey, kind of the final thing that I wanted to ask you about is how was your journey of finding love again? And now that you're married, how was that journey for you in finding love again? And yeah, how was that?
Well, it's been a beautiful journey. I didn't think that I would. I didn't think it was possible to find love again, to have a love story like I had with Amanda. I'm a hopeless romantic at heart, and so I love the way that Amanda and I met, and our journey and our relationship and our friendship. I love it. You actually catch a lot of it in Nothing Is Wasted, the book. I go do a lot of flashbacks to kind of tell just the journey of that. And so after she passed, I had this really significant question: am I ever going to have a meaningful marriage? Am I ever
Mm.
going to love again? Um, it was a deep, deep wrestling, and my heart felt dead. It felt like it was literally, it felt like it was dead and buried. It would never come alive again. And there were different ebbs and flows of feelings of despair within that. Um, but I'll never forget seeing Christy for the first time, and all of a sudden, can't explain it other than the Holy Spirit. My heart woke up, and I didn't know anything about her. Like it was, so there was something that drew me to her and intrigued me about her before I knew anything about her. Well, then as I got to know her more, I realized, man, she loves the Lord. She's walked through some deep pain. She gets it, but she's
Yeah.
come out on the other side really loving the Lord even more and following him more faithfully and serving him. And so I was intrigued by her. I watched her. The whole story is in the book, but I watched her for several months. It wasn't creepy, I promise. Although sometimes she says that it did seem kind of creepy, but I just couldn't, for whatever reason, I just could not. She had started attending the church that I pastored. She was coming there with some friends, and it was just like something about her, but she avoided me like the plague. And then I found out about 3 or 4 months after I met her for the first time just why she avoided me. And it was because she was too close to my story. And so I get in a conversation with her. I'd say I cornered her very pastorally in the gym one day. Wasn't creepy at all. And I asked her, "Hey, you've been coming to my church for like 3 months. What's your story? Like, what's your Jesus story?"
Yeah.
And she ends up telling me. Apparently, that's how pastors date. I was very rusty, I guess, at the time. Just really getting spitting my game. And she tells me her story, and then through the one thing leads to another in the conversation, she ends up telling me that her stepdad is one of the chaplains for our prison system, and that he had been assigned to the three men that killed my wife, and that he visits them every week and shares the gospel with them.
Wow.
And man, it was just like, what, God, what are you doing? Like that you would draw my heart to this woman and that she would be this close to my story and to the perpetrators of my story. Like, whoa. And I knew God was doing something, so I had to get to the bottom of it. I wish I could say something profound came out of my mouth. All I said was, "Do you want to go grab some dinner?" But over the next couple of weeks, I just started realizing, man, God is inviting me into a story that is bigger than me, and asking, "Will you step into this upside down kingdom where you'll show the beauty of the gospel even to the people who were the ones who were responsible for the upending of your life?" And so that's been kind of the journey that we've been on, among other things. At the end of that year, the end of 2017, we got married. I finally convinced her to go on a date with me, right? And then we started falling for each other and got married and blended our families together, daughter from her previous marriage, son from mine, and we have one of our own now. So an 11-year-old, an almost 10-year-old, and a 4-year-old. And it's just been a beautiful, difficult, amazing journey to take these two paths that are both marred by pain and bring them together and figure out how do we not let how do we let God transform our pain together so it doesn't transfer onto people around us and onto our kids? How do we really walk in healing, and how do we become healing agents for other people?
Mhm.
Ezekiel 47:12 is like our life verse that says their fruit and their leaves will be for healing because they're planted by the streams or the river that flows from the sanctuary. That is
Mm.
the image that we just keep thinking. Man, if we just plant ourselves by the river of life that flows from the sanctuary of God, the presence of God, then
Yeah.
our leaves will be for healing for other people. The fruit that we bear will be for healing for others. And that's what we're doing with Nothing is Wasted, the ministry. That's what we're hoping for when it comes to this book. And that's what we're trying to live out every single day.
Yeah, that's so good. So now talking about the book, Nothing is Wasted. Of course, we want people to go get a copy of the book, and all that info people can find in down below in the description.
Here you go.
Um,
Got a
Nothing
copy
is,
right here. We actually just got
yep,
there you go. Got our copies in right here.
nice, nice. What is it really hope? What is your hope that people learn from this book, and also learning more about your story?
Well, my hope is that again, they don't look at my story and go, "Wow, that was a really inspiring story," or "Oh, wow, what an amazing guy." I
Yeah.
want them to see themselves in the story, which is why I wrote it the way I did. Like, I'm not the hero of this story. I'm
Hmm.
not. You're going to read it and you're going to see like there was really God as the hero, and he's the one that brought so many different people into my life, so many different guides, if you will, so many different providential moments where it was like, and it's like this aha moment where God is just infusing hope and healing into me. And my hope is that as the reader is reading this, that they're going to see their own story in it, and that these truths that God led me into are the same things that they need in that moment as they read it. And that God, they look at it and go, wow, God is an amazing God. If he can do it in Davy's story, he can do it in my story too. So that's really my hope. And there's so much about Amanda's story in there. I want to honor her life and legacy because she was just such a faithful woman of God. I mean, just enduring faithfulness. And so you're going to see and you're going to fall in love with her. And you're going to see why I fell in love with her. And then you're going to really get her heart just bleeds through the whole thing because her heart for you as the listener, you as the reader, you as the watcher of this is that you would have an enduring relationship with Jesus, that you would love him more than anything else in this world.
Mm. Actually, there's one thing that just came to mind is
Yeah.
I think also when tragedy strikes, there's a temptation to walk away from faith.
Mm,
There's that
absolutely.
temptation is I think sometimes the hurt is so real that you know people would say, God's not real, or I'm just going to walk away from this because, my God has failed me. What would you say to those that are in that hurt where the hurt's been so real to them
Yeah.
that they are tempted to walk away, or they have walked away?
Yeah. Well, that's a very real question and a very I think, a very normal question to wrestle with. Um, all of these kinds of situations shake our faith. Um, and they shake all of our faith. It doesn't matter how like strong in your faith you are. Somehow the thing that we have to shift to is figuring out how do we not let it shake our faith, but instead shape our faith,
Yeah.
as this refining fire that we're going through. But I think you see in scripture, people have the same reaction. I mean, Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead, but before he raised Lazarus from the dead, before he restored that situation, he comes across the scene, and both Mary and Martha are like, what, how did you let this happen?
Yeah.
And their faith was shaken. And Jesus himself saw the people who were mourning, and it says the shortest, most poignant verse in the Bible, Jesus wept. Why did he weep? I mean, he knew what he was going to do. He knew the miracle he was about to perform. Well, he wept because this was not how he meant his creation to be. He did not mean for loss and pain and sin and death and agony and despair. That was
Hmm.
not his original plan. And I think he wept for many, many reasons. I think he knew very soon he was going to go and pay the price to make available the forgiveness of sins and the restoration of all things so that we can be resurrected in him. And I think he knew, as he was empathizing with us, we serve a high priest who can empathize with everything we've gone through. He gets it, he understands. I think he felt the weight of that kind of grief. And so I would say this: Jesus understands.
Mm.
He understands. If nobody else in here or nobody else in your life understands what you're going through, he understands. And so while it's very easy, very common to just say, forget all of this, Jesus, he doesn't see me, he doesn't care, he must not even be real. I'm telling you right now, God wants to step into this pain with you, and he wants to minister to you in a way that nobody else can. And he wants to bring hope, he wants to bring healing, he wants to be a salve to your soul. And ultimately, what he wants to do is he wants to bring meaning and purpose out of this, even though it's senseless. And one day, I promise, one day he will restore all things. He will make all of this right. He has a plan to do that. And J.R.R. Tolkien says he will make all things sad be untrue. And so while it may not be on our time frame or in ways that we would expect, he has the perfect plan in mind, and his ways are so much higher than our ways. And if you just lean into him, I promise you, he is going to do so much in your life that you never could have imagined as he restores your soul.
That's so good. Well, Davey, thank you so much for your time and pouring into this episode. I learned so much more about your story and journey. And for those listening or watching, definitely get plugged into Nothing is Wasted Ministries. And also don't forget to get your copy of the book, and all more info will be provided after the episode. So you can definitely connect with Davey and his ministry.
Thank you, Cameron. It's been an honor to be with you guys.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much for tuning in on today's podcast. If you want to connect with Davey Blackburn and get a copy of his book, all the information is provided in the podcast description below, or on YouTube in the description down below if you are watching. And thank you again for tuning in. I really hope this interview really helped, added value to you, and really helps you on your journey of faith, whatever that looks like for you. And it's great to be back on this podcast. Great to be back and bringing you guests your way. And so keep tuning in every Thursday. We'll be bringing you a guest, and also be doing some preaching and some sermons and sharing my faith journey as well. So feel free to share this with someone that you think that might need to hear this message. And also, if this is your first time, feel free to subscribe. Thank you again for tuning in, and we'll catch you again next Thursday.